The biting wind seemed to mock my misfortune as I trudged up the winding path towards the monastery. Losing my job had been a blow, and this position, caretaker at a remote, almost forgotten sanctuary, was my last hope. The imposing structure loomed against the bruised twilight sky, an unsettling silhouette against the dying light. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. The air thrummed with an unseen energy, a silent hum that set my teeth on edge. The massive oak doors groaned open as I approached, revealing an echoing darkness within. Taking a shaky breath, I stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly warm, the silence broken only by the soft crackle of a fire in a distant hearth. As my eyes adjusted, I saw him. A figure shrouded in shadow emerged from the gloom. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the deep cowl of his robe. "Welcome." His voice was a low rasp, ancient and strangely comforting. "We have been expecting you." He led me through a labyrinth of corridors, the stone walls damp and cold against my touch. The oppressive silence was broken only by the rhythmic echo of our footsteps. We reached a small, sparsely furnished room. "This will be your quarters," the monk gestured. "Rest. We will speak more in the morning." Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I fell into a deep sleep. But my dreams were troubled by unsettling visions, flickering shadows, crimson eyes, and a chilling sense of being watched. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of chanting. Following the sound, I found myself in a grand chapel. A small group of monks knelt in prayer, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and an unsettling feeling of dread crept over me. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. I cleaned the ancient halls, tended the gardens, and prepared simple meals. The monks remained distant, their faces always hidden, their voices hushed whispers. Yet there was a strange sense of peace within the monastery walls, a serenity that I hadn't felt in years. But this tranquility was shattered one night. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the halls, jolting me awake. My heart pounded as I grabbed a lantern and rushed towards the sound. The scream had come from the chapel. Pushing open the heavy doors, I gasped. The room was bathed in an eerie red light, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. In the center of the room, a figure lay sprawled on the stone floor, one of the monks. His robe was torn, revealing a gaping wound on his neck, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Panic seized me. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. As I turned to flee, a figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and with eyes that glowed like burning coals. He moved with an unnatural speed, his hand reaching out to grasp my arm. "Don't be afraid." His voice was a low hiss, sending shivers down my spine. He was weak. He gave in to temptation. My blood ran cold. I was trapped, alone with what? He pulled me closer, and I caught a glimpse of his face in the flickering lantern light. It was as pale as moonlight, with sharp, angular features and eyes that burned with an unholy fire. His lips parted, revealing long, sharp canines. A scream caught in my throat, but before it could escape, he clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling the sound. "Hush now," he whispered, his voice a chilling caress. "There's no need for fear. We mean you no harm." His words were a lie, I knew it. But his touch, despite the terror that gripped me, held a strange allure. It was as if his very presence was weaving a spell, a seductive darkness that threatened to consume me. He led me deeper into the monastery, down winding corridors and hidden passageways. The chanting had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. We arrived at a heavy wooden door, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. He pushed it open, revealing a hidden chamber. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the center stood an altar, draped in a blood-red cloth, and gathered around it were the other monks, their faces still hidden in the shadows of their hoods. Their eyes, however, were fixed on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We are not what you think," the monk who had brought me here said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "We are different, but we are not evil." He stepped aside, and the others moved closer, their forms shifting and swaying in the dim light. I saw then what I had refused to believe. Their skin was pale, almost translucent. Their movements were fluid, unnatural. And their eyes, those crimson eyes that burned with an insatiable hunger. They were vampires. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. One of the vampires stepped forward, a woman with long, flowing black hair and piercing red eyes. She reached out a hand, her touch sending a shiver down my spine. "We need you," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You can help us." Help them? How could I possibly help these creatures of the night? I was just a caretaker, a woman who had stumbled into their hidden world by chance. "We are seeking redemption," another vampire said, his voice deep and resonant. "We have been isolated for centuries, atoning for our past sins, but now our sanctuary is threatened." He gestured towards a hidden passage behind the altar. "There are others out there, hunters who seek to destroy us. They are closing in, and we are not strong enough to fight them alone." My mind reeled. Vampires, hunters, a hidden war. It was all too much to comprehend. But one thing was clear. I was caught in the middle, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. The vampires gathered closer, their eyes pleading, their touch both terrifying and strangely alluring. They needed my help, they said. I could be their salvation. But could I trust them? Could I risk my life for these creatures of the night? And then a chilling thought struck me. What if they weren't seeking redemption at all? What if this was all a trap, a way to lure me into their clutches? The bite on my arm throbbed, a constant reminder of their power, their hunger. As I hesitated, the ground suddenly shook beneath my feet. A deafening roar echoed through the monastery, followed by the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. The hunters had arrived. The chamber descended into chaos. The vampires hissed and snarled, their eyes flashing with fear and fury. The woman with the long black hair, who had called herself Lilith, grabbed my hand. "Come with us," she urged, pulling me towards the hidden passage. But I hesitated. The hunters were closing in, their shouts and the sounds of their weapons echoing through the monastery. If I went with the vampires, I would be choosing a side in a war I didn't understand, a war I wanted no part in. "No," I said, pulling my hand away. "I can't." Lilith's eyes widened in surprise. "But they will kill you!" "Maybe," I said, my voice trembling, "but maybe not." I turned towards the sound of approaching footsteps, my heart pounding in my chest. The heavy wooden door burst open, and a group of men rushed in, armed with crossbows and stakes. They stopped short, their eyes widening at the sight of the vampires. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then the leader of the hunters, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Surrender yourselves," he growled, "and no one else needs to get hurt." The vampires snarled, ready to fight, but then something unexpected happened. One of the monks, the one who had first greeted me, stepped forward. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We mean you no harm," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We only seek to live in peace." The hunters hesitated, their weapons still raised. But the monk's words seemed to have an effect. The leader lowered his crossbow slightly. "Why should we believe you?" he asked. "You are creatures of darkness. You prey on the innocent." The monk shook his head. "We have renounced our old ways," he said. "We feed only on animals, and we harm no one. We only wish to be left alone." There was another tense silence. Then, to my surprise, the leader of the hunters lowered his crossbow completely. "Very well," he said. "We will leave you in peace, but if we ever hear of you harming anyone, we will return." The hunters turned and left the chamber, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. The vampires watched them go, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Lilith turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You have saved us." I shook my head. "I did nothing," I said. "It was him." I gestured towards the monk who had spoken to the hunters. He smiled, a surprisingly warm and gentle expression. "You gave us a chance," he said. "You showed them that we are not all monsters." In the days that followed, the vampires and the hunters reached an uneasy truce. The vampires remained in their sanctuary, living in peace and harming no one. And the hunters, though still wary, agreed to leave them alone. As for me, I stayed on at the monastery. I no longer feared the vampires. In fact, I had come to respect them, to see them as complex and even noble creatures. And in them, I found a sense of belonging, a family that I had never known before. But it was a reminder of the night I had faced my fears and chosen compassion over prejudice. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope for redemption, for peace, and even for love. And so, I remained in the Midnight Sanctuary, a caretaker, a friend, and a protector of those who had once been my greatest fear. The vampires, in their own way, had become my family, and I knew that I would never be truly alone again.